Again, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It's really nice to see everyone. It's really nice to be together on this Shabbos morning. I think I'm glad on everyone's behalf that I'm the only one who actually had to go outside this morning. I saved you all the trouble by being here to open the Ark. And yeah, it's, wonderful morning to sit inside the comfort of our own houses and enjoy a little Shabbos morning davening together. So we are going to be joined by Reverend Lou Lassard, hopefully more or less any minute now, and he's going to speak at the end of the Torah service. So I want to take the opportunity to share a couple of my own thoughts this morning. As I mentioned earlier, we read Parshat Beshalach this morning, which literally means, when Pharaoh sent the Israelites out. It is the actual Exodus. It is the actual leaving. And this parsha, as I said, it's also known as Shabbat Shirah, the Shabbos of the song, as we are going to be incredibly lucky to have Sharon read the first part of our Torah reading this morning, including the famous Song of the Sea. But there is so much more in this parsha. In looking over text for this week, last year as part of my rabbinical school curriculum, we did the book of Exodus over the course of the entire academic year. And I was looking through the curriculum for that class, and by my count, we spent 8 different 1.5-hour class sessions just on events that happen in Parshat Beshalach, because it really is, it's chock full of narrative, it's chock full of poetry, and it's chock full of drama. In addition to just the Israelites leaving and the miracle at the sea, there's also these beautiful details of the cloud that led them out of Egypt, and also, the fire by night and the cloud by day that protected them. There's the drama of the miracle at the sea. There's the poetry of the Song of the Sea. And then, of course, we have, all these kind of inklings and hints that things begin to go south pretty much immediately after they cross over the sea. We have the events that happen of the bitter waters, where the Israelites realize that they don't have any water to drink and they complain, and then that happens again seemingly just days later. And then they realize that they are hungry, and that they say they miss Egypt, where they got, bread and meat and all this stuff. And we can kind of, it's foreshadowing of a lot of the tension that will really carry through between the Israelites and Moshe and God through the rest of the Torah. And then, of course, another really famous passage at the end of this week's Parsha is the nation of Amalek attacking Israel basically when they were at their weakest. And this sets up a long simmering tension between those two nations, and the very famous passage that we read a couple times a year, and we'll read leading up to Purim, of that's known as Zachor, of kind of remembering, which is this passage of, ironically, remember the nation of Amalek and what they did to you by wiping them off the face of the earth. And so, you can see how this would take a cohort of rabbinical students in 5 or 6 weeks to unpack. And this morning, what we'll focus on, what I've asked Lou to focus on, our Reverend Lou, is a little bit about that piece of the food and the manna, and kind of how that sense of food insecurity really drives a lot of this conflict, and how the impact, kind of the wider impacts of food insecurity. But I will give him a full intro after the Torah reading. What I want to talk a little bit, I want to revisit the idea of singing just for a couple of minutes. There are a lot of really, really famous midrashim, really famous kind of apocryphal stories that are told about the events in this week's Parsha. And there are several very famous and slightly contradicting ones about the actual splitting of the sea, like the moment when it splits. The most famous one is actually one that a lot of people, myself as a child included, are taught so hand in hand with the text that people don't realize that it's not actually in the text. And that is that at the moment the sea was split, basically no one wanted to go in. And so one of the leaders of the tribes of Judah, Nachshon ben Aminadav, basically ran into the ocean and ran into the sea. And once he got up to his neck, because of that level of faith and willing to take a risk, that's the moment when the sea split. The story of Nachshon ben Aminadav, his name is elsewhere in the Torah. It is nowhere in relation to the splitting of the sea, but like I said, that's a story that many people think is actually in the biblical text. But there are actually two different versions of that story that are debated in the Talmud. One says that, in fact, each of the 12 tribes was fighting about which one of them would get to go into the sea first. They all wanted to kind of lead the way with their faith. And it was actually the tribe of Benjamin that just kind of plunged in while everyone else was arguing. Another version of that story tells that each of the 12 tribes did not want to be the one to go first. They were all a little bit too apprehensive and scared. And finally, the tribe of Judah, led by Nachshon ben Aminadav, plows ahead and is the first to go in while everyone else is arguing, and the sea splits. And there's another version of this story and these kind of levels of apprehension. And this other version tells that there were actually 4 different factions within the people of Israel. There was one group of people who, by the side of the sea, when they saw the Egyptians closing in on them, felt complete despair and wanted to essentially throw themselves into the sea as an alternative to surrendering to Egypt. They didn't necessarily have faith that there was going to be a miracle, but they saw that as kind of their most noble and dignified escape. The second group of people didn't want to throw themselves in the sea, but also saw their situation as hopeless, and so they were advocating to just surrender to the Egyptians and give up. The third group of people wanted to make a stand and fight and try to overcome the Egyptians with their own strength and might. And then the fourth faction in the Israelites wanted to kind of use other modes to win. So whether that would be trickery or confusing the Egyptians, but they thought that the Israelites would overcome, but they didn't want to, they knew they wouldn't win in kind of a direct battle scenario. And it's only once Moshe was able to talk to all 4 of these groups and kind of unify them that the sea began to split and the Israelites passed through in the center. And then there's one more version of the splitting of the sea that I want to bring up this morning. And that is actually very counter to the way I think many of us envision it. I think I'll speak for myself. I generally envision one grand split, right? And one wall on either side and the people passing right through the middle. There's actually a midrashic tradition that has no bearing in the text that in fact the sea split into 12 different paths, one for each tribe. And each tribe continued on their own in dry land with their own walls of water on either side of them. And it seems like maybe they could see each other through windows in the water, and they were kind of connected that way, but that they could each they were each following in God's footsteps. They could each see God walking in front of them. And whichever of these stories, I think they're all interesting midrashim. I think they all kind of bring us to a different interpretation of the events at the sea. But one thing that kind of unites all of them is actually that there was a startling lack of unity among the people. It's certainly not like the storybook version of the splitting of the sea, or or the movie version of the splitting of the sea. They all represent a very fractured nation. And I think I find a lot of comfort in the Song of the Sea, because I think the Song of the Sea really kind of pushes back against this narrative of a fractured nation. I think the Song of the Sea, both the song that we'll read as Az Yashir and the song that is Miriam's song, it's really impossible to imagine it any other way but seeing a nation unified. And even though this really is a poem or a song of victory, which was kind of narratively sung on the far shores, I like to imagine that they were singing it as they walked through. And I particularly kind of like to tell myself the story and like to imagine it for myself with this narrative of the 12 different paths. And maybe the people couldn't see each other through the water, through the walls of water, but I like to imagine that maybe they could hear each other. And maybe they were all singing together. And as they walked, each of the 12 tribes on their own different way, they weren't able to see each other, but they could hear each other. And they were unified by song. And that's what kind of gave them the strength to jump into the water in the first place, right? That's what really brought their faith in God into one cohesive whole as a nation. And that's, unifying their voices is what unified them as a people. And I challenge us, as I said earlier, to just continue thinking about the value of song in our life. I know just looking around my screen, it's wonderful to have Ron here this morning, and I know how much value song and music plays in his life. And, I also look at Leah, and I look at so many of you who, whether you sing professionally or recreationally or just along with me when you're here on a Shabbos morning, thinking about how song is a unifier for so many of us, and thinking about how that is something that really is integral to our own building of community and our own unification, and the role that continues to play and the role it plays over Zoom. And I think how one of the aspects that we're most eager to get back to of being in person is hearing each other's voices and singing together. And I hope that as Sharon reads us through the Song of the Sea, that's something we can keep in mind. And there are some verses where we traditionally kind of at least mumble them together with her as she reads them. And whether you're muted or unmuted, and whether you know them or not, or you know the words or not, think about raising your voice, even if it's just humming, and kind of building our own unity that way.